All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third session of the day, of the last day of Azure Data Week. We hope that you guys have been enjoying everything. If you guys haven't had a chance or this is your first session attending live, please feel free to answer the poll questions down at the bottom. We would love to hear from you. And also, like I said before, please let us know how we're doing and ways we could have made it better. We would love to hear from you guys on that too. I am going to go, since we're already about 7 minutes behind, I'm going to go ahead and start and let Josh take over. So Josh, whenever you're ready, you have the floor.
Awesome. Can you still hear me?
Yep, I can still hear you. And if everybody, I'm sorry, if everybody can give us a thumbs up just really quickly so we can make sure that the sound's okay, we can get started here. Just want to test the sound, make sure you guys are hearing us okay. All right, perfect. Sound is good. All right, Josh, yeah, go ahead and take over.
All right, awesome. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining the session today on Azure Monitor and Azure Alerting. We're going to talk today about monitoring your workloads that you have in Azure or that you are planning to have in Azure throughout the process here today. Let me see if I can get rid of this little pop up there. There we go. So definitely feel free to ask some questions as we go along. It's definitely want to make sure you guys kind of get the full experience here, but we're going to pivot from specifically data to how to monitor the data that's in your environment and how to make sure that it's running optimally and your costs are in check and the whole 9 yards. So we'll jump right in as we're slightly behind here. A little bit about me. I am a cloud architect focusing in Azure, IT, and Office 365. My focus is more on the infrastructure side rather than the data side. So that's kind of why I'm presenting this topic here today, focusing on Azure Monitor, data collection, data visualization, data response, and then integrating your data and exporting that data to other environments that you may already have some investment in. So jumping right in and getting started for what is Azure Monitor, we're going to talk about what it is in the first place, why I should care, and what it does for me as an IT professional. So Azure Monitor really it provides you visibility into your Azure environment in 4 key areas. Number 1 is the activities in your environment. What are people doing in the environment itself? Are they creating resources, deleting resources, changing the tiers of resources? It really allows you to get some visibility into what your users are doing in the Azure environment itself. Also, it gives you performance metrics. So how are your Azure resources performing? Is there resources that are maybe too big, you need to downsize that, or maybe there's resources that are getting slammed and you need to scale up those resources. Next, we have the health of your environment. So are there any optimizations that could be done to increase the usability of your resources? Perhaps something is going on with a specific region in Azure, and you might be able to pivot that to a different region, implement your disaster recovery strategy. And similarly, availability. Is there anything that can be done to increase the uptime of your workloads in Azure? For the same reasons, maybe there's some sort of service degradation in one of the resources or one of the data centers in Azure. Can that be pivoted somewhere else? Maybe there's an issue with a certain workload in Azure itself, and maybe you could pivot it to a different strategy. And Azure Monitor, excuse me, does these things with 2 types of telemetry tools. One is metrics and one is logs. And we're going to talk about the difference between metrics and logs further in the presentation. So breaking up the presentation we have today, I know I have about 50 minutes left, so we're just going to move right along, leave some time at the end for questions as well. We're going to break this presentation up into these 4 areas, as I mentioned. First, data collection. How do they get the data in the first place? Second is visualization and analyzation. How do you look at this data? How do you make sense of the massive data that's coming in? Next is responding. So are you manually going to respond to these things, or are you going to maybe add some automation to automatically respond to these events? And then finally, and I think one of the most important and often overlooked features is integration and export. Azure Monitor is not necessarily just for Azure resources. Similarly, you can export all those data to your own third-party SIM tool if you wanted to, if you already have investment in that area, and you can dump that straight into the tool that you already have purchased. So obviously, we're going to start with data collection. It's a natural place to start because we need some sort of data to do this analysis and integration and alerting. So we'll start with what data is captured by Azure Monitor and how does it do this? So to answer the question, what does Azure Monitor collect? It really collects data in 5 different areas. It collects operation data, management data, health data, performance data in 5 key areas. Number 1 is the Azure tenant as a whole. So the operation of tenant level Azure services, things that are going on with your subscription. Are you adding subscriptions, removing subscriptions? Are you changing things in Azure Active Directory? Those kind of tenant-wide operations is being collected with Azure Monitor by default. Second is things that are going on inside the subscription itself. So are you modifying the subscription? Are you changing the payment method? Are you, again, adding multiple subscriptions, deleting subscriptions? What is the health of the subscription in general? Going one step deeper, Azure resources within the tenant and within a subscription are also being monitored, specifically the performance and the health of these resources. So is your SQL database performing optimally? Is there an issue with a certain virtual machine you have deployed? How is the networking performing in your environment? All of these things are being collected by Azure Monitor itself by default as well. Next, I think another often overlooked feature of Azure Monitor is the application layer. So you can actually tap into the performance and functionality of the code you have deployed within Azure itself. Using things like application insights, you can actually write your own custom monitoring code to actually pull information from your custom written code in Azure and get some performance metrics on those applications itself. And then last, we have Guest OS. I think this is one of the most powerful features in Azure Monitor, not only for the cloud resources you have deployed in Azure, or maybe you have deployed in AWS or Google Cloud, but also your on-premise operating systems. You can have all of that data piped in to Azure Monitor and basically have a single pane of glass across the entire board of how your guest operating systems are performing across every application, across every tier, across every cloud. So I mentioned we're going to come back to the difference between metrics and logs, and I think it's an important distinction to start with. Azure Monitor is collecting both of these types of data. Metrics are numerical values that describe an Azure system in a point in time. It's taking a snapshot of that system or that resource at a point in time. They're known for being really lightweight and capable of real-time reporting. So you can see on the left there, we have a graph of all of these data points. Obviously, you can chart these data points out over time and get these graphs. Similarly, but there are some important distinctions. Logs don't necessarily need to be numeric. They can be. They could be numeric type data, but it's usually telemetry type data that you can piece together to see events or kind of patterns of different events that you need to troubleshoot. Kind of a big difference is usually metrics are, as you see on the left here, graphed, whereas logs are queried. With that query language you can see in the screenshot on the upper right, you can pull a set of queries and get a result, much like a SQL-esque language. And if you get some results that tend to show a pattern, you can also graph these results if the data makes sense, if those are numeric data. But it doesn't have to be numeric. It could just be user logged on, user logged off. Maybe a resource was deallocated, a resource was paused. All of these things could be tracked as a log as well. So this is a blown up view of a visual created with the Metrics Explorer showing average CPU percentage across 2 separate instances within Azure. So you can see it's graphical. You can see peaks and valleys. It's much easier to look at it in a graphical format because these metrics data are collecting data every 5 minutes on your resources. So seeing that just textually, I think will overwhelm most people. But having that in a visual format, you can really see where your peaks and where your valleys are. And using this data, you can determine if it makes sense to increase the level of your resource, maybe from a D1 to a D2, something like that, or maybe even downsize. So right sizing is something that's very important too. And I think that's kind of the opposite viewpoint that people think about Azure Monitor, but it's something I want to stress here in this presentation today. Azure Monitor is not only for, hey, I'm not performing well. It's also for, am I managing my costs well? So you can see here that this resource is only spiked to 30% across this time period shown, and you can expand and shorten the time period as you want. But maybe you take a look at this graph and you say 30%, maybe I'm okay with it hovering and peaking at 60%. So you can actually lower the CPU tier, save some costs in your Azure environment. It's all about right sizing your environment, not just getting the best and the greatest. You really want to pay for what you really need and not pay for overkill. That's where you're really going to find the best bang for your buck within the Azure environment. So think of Azure Monitor as a way, yes, to look at your performance and your health of your resources, but also the opposite is just as true. Look at it as a way to optimize your cost in the Azure environment as well. And here's a blown up view of the log analytics, just to kind of show this query language and displaying the relevant log events for troubleshooting or even alerting. So if you want to see if these event level error pops up, anytime one pops up or anytime more than 5 pop up, if there's some sort of threshold you want to play with, you can just click the new alert button at the upper right there, and it'll create an alert rule for you. And we'll talk more about alert rules and how to respond to these events later in the presentation. But this is a great way to troubleshoot your environment. If you're noticing some issues with a certain resource, you can go in here and pull all of the errors, pull all of the warnings and stuff like that to see if there's any correlation you can make with the log events that are being traced and the metrics, the performance of your environment. So to kind of summarize, we wanted to talk about the differences between metrics and logs. You can see in this chart here, we talked about most of these already. So benefits of metrics, they're obviously lightweight, near real-time reporting, great for alerts. Logs are also able to be alerted on as well, but it's ideal for that deep analysis. So usually you start with metrics and say, hey, there's an issue going on, and then you dive into the logs to see why is that going on. Data of a metric is more numeric, whereas data of a log is textual or numeric. Metrics they have a standard set of properties, whereas logs could be properties of varying types depending on the log. So for instance, metrics are numbers, their CPU percent, or their uptime, or things like that, whereas logs could just be a timestamp, and event description. It could be quite anything. Collection of metrics are at regular intervals. Like I said, they happen to come every minute or 5 minutes, depending on how you set it up. Logs are collected sporadically as those events trigger. So it could be you have no logs for a week, and then you get dumped 100 logs all at once if an event happens. So that's kind of a difference between the two as well. I showed you in the Azure portal where you get to both of these things. Number one, metrics is in Metrics Explorer, logs is in Log Analytics. Some things that are confusing for some, and I'll make sure I highlight, is similar to how a rectangle is not a square, but a square is a rectangle. It's kind of the same thing here, right? So a metric is a log, but a log is not necessarily a metric. So you'll see metric data in Log Analytics, but you will not see log data in the Metrics Explorer. So a metric is a log, and you'll see a subset of there in Log Analytics. But Metrics Explorer was created to really give you that quick and easy way to graph this data, and I think you'll have much more success there. But you can export that data just as you can export log data, and we'll talk about that when we get to the export section of this presentation. One thing that is critically important and is another highlight of this presentation, if you take away a couple of things, I think this is one of the most important. Retention of data. So by default, metrics are available for a 90-day period, and this changes pretty frequently. So keep up to date on what that level is. And I believe that Microsoft is going through right now a kind of changing the way of how metrics and Metrics Explorer and Azure Monitor in general, what you get by default. But at least to date, it was a 90-day period at no charge, and that is expandable. Obviously, it is expandable by porting it to that Log Analytics workspace, as I just mentioned. Keep in mind that one of your most important things to consider when you're implementing an Azure Monitor strategy is what your retention should be. You don't want it too long because do you really care about if your CPU spiked to 35% 4 years ago? Probably not. But you do care if it spiked 6 months ago that also correlated to a downturn in your sales, which maybe was related to nobody being able to access your systems for a period, or they were receiving error messages on your system. So normally I see this about 12 to 13 months to get a full year, or 13 months of data to kind of have that correlation ability. But you don't want to keep it too long because then you're just storing that data for no reason. You're paying for that data storage for no reason. Um, Finding that sweet spot is critically important here. And you have to determine what makes sense for the metric data and what makes sense for the log data separately. They could be the same, they can be different, and you'll need to see where that sweet spot is to really get the most bang for your buck there. All right, so let me switch over to this. We're going to jump into visualization and analyzation here in a sec, but let me take a quick scroll through the questions here and see if I can answer any at this point, or if we're going to cover it. I see, is log analytics enabled by default? Is it separate from Azure monitoring service? The answer is sort of. As I mentioned today, like the square and the rectangle thing, metric is a log is not a metric. So you'll notice in the Azure environment, if you go into Azure Monitor, there should be a button on the left-hand blade that says Diagnostic Settings. If you click on Diagnostic Settings, you'll be able to see a list of all of your resources within that subscription. This is subscription by subscription, keep in mind. You'll see a list of all of your subscriptions, or all of your resources in that subscription that has diagnostic turned on or diagnostic turned off. It's quite visual. It's kind of the best way to look at that. So click on Azure Monitor, and then on the first blade, you'll see diagnostic settings. If you click on that, you'll see a list of all of the resources that either have logs turned on or logs turned off, and you can customize what types of logs are being pulled back. And those types of logs are different for each resource. So some resources have different types of logs, obviously, depending on what resource it is. You can go in and hit the checkbox for which ones you want to save. You'll notice when you are in this screen, if you're going to go in and try it here now or today, or at some point in the near future, notice that you'll see other options. So you can pipe it into Event Hub. You could pipe it into a third-party SIM tool if you want to connect it directly. And one of the options in there will be store to either a storage account or Log Analytics workspace. I highly recommend the Log Analytics workspace. It gives you that query ability. If you pipe it to a storage account, it's just storing that data, and you're going to have to figure out a way to parse through that by yourself. So definitely at least pipe it into Log Analytics workspace. The cost related to that is quite minimal because they're just log data, depending on how much that machine is sending the logs to you. So I definitely recommend doing that and kind of testing that out and seeing what data you really need to bring back. But keep in mind, retention is important. By 90 days, you have, or by default, you have 90 days for metrics, 31 days for logs. Obviously, that is usually not enough. I think the lowest I've seen is about 3 months. So for both. So keep that in mind. But that is the answer to that question. They are separate. Azure Monitor is enabled by default on all of the resources that you create in Azure. All of your third-party resources clearly are not enabled by default. You'll need to add a third-party extension tool to pipe that data up to Azure. Log Analytics, some resources have that turned on if you have a Log Analytics workspace already created, but most of them are disabled by default. You'll have to enable those resources that you want those logs to come back for. How long is data retained in Azure Metric? Azure Metrics are 90 days. Like I said, they're kind of changing the way that works currently. So this might change on the Microsoft side, but to date, it's 90 days of Azure Metric data, and you can extend that by piping it to a Log Analytics workspace. Another question I see is it similar to tools such as Splunk? It is similar to that. I think Splunk is, I don't want to necessarily say a competitor because I actually have a number of engagements where you use both. So I think the power of Azure Monitor is what we're going to talk about here in a couple seconds, which is how you respond and how you integrate and export. I have a number of clients that actually utilize Azure Monitor for Azure stuff and Splunk for everything else. The downside to that is you have two panes of glass and you really want one. So if you want that single pane of glass, it's really best to pipe all of the data into one or the other. And we'll talk about how that works. That's kind of the same question there. If we already have subscription to external tools in place. So yeah, and that goes both ways. So like I said, for piping the data into one or the other, you can pipe data into Azure Monitor and you can pipe data out of Azure Monitor. So if you wanted Azure Monitor to be your single pane of glass, that is absolutely doable. And if you wanted Splunk or something else, SolarWinds to be your single pane of glass, you can pump that data out. But I wouldn't think of it as a one or the other type thing. You can definitely use it in conjunction. Most of my customers that use both and end up piping the data out of Azure Monitor into something like Splunk, they still use the respond section. So the next section after the one we're about to hit, they still use the respond section because it's just so integrated within the environment. You can scale up, scale down, scale out very quickly and easily. And then the last question I have here is the cost monitoring. We talked about that a little bit with kind of seeing if your cost is appropriate based on the level and tier of your environment. So if you have 30% average and maybe you're comfortable with the 50% average, you can tweak that as you want. However, there are a couple of other cost monitoring tools that are out there, one of which is built into the Azure environment. They actually purchased a company called Cloudin that gives you a lot more cost management options. That's not really covered in this presentation here today, but I do have a webinar on that, and it goes pretty detailed on that environment. So if you want to take a look at that webinar, be sure to take a look at that and see if you have any further questions and let us know, and we can definitely talk more about cost monitoring. Awesome, good questions. If you have anything else, let me know. We'll keep going with the presentation here, and I'll keep an eye out on the question as well. So next, now that we have the logs, we've collected them, basically we want to know how we can visualize them. So how do you make Azure Monitor data consumable? And we talked a little bit about how some of that works. It's really three options. You have views, dashboards, and then Power BI. So starting with views, views are something that's being changed currently within Azure Monitor as well. They're going through a revamp of the Azure Monitor environment kind of across the board. You'll notice a lot of similarities between this and the next one I'm going to talk about, dashboards. Views and dashboards are basically used for trying to have a wide view of multiple types of resources or multiple types of log events and kind of look at them again on a single pane of glass and see what makes sense for correlation. Advantages for views is they're great for rich visualizations of the log type data. You can export and import views. You can transfer them to different resource groups or different subscriptions. It's integrated within Azure itself, so you don't need to go to a separate place to do this. You can filter for custom parameters. And it's interactive. It supports multiple level drill downs, drill throughs, all of those types of things. So if you want to zoom in on one specific type of data in one of these columns you see here, you have that ability. Some limitations of views, though, to keep in mind is currently they do not support metrics. They only support log data. But keep in mind that you can pipe metrics into your log and kind of get a workaround to that. Workbooks are something that you're going to be seeing coming that are going to kind of bridge that gap, if you will. Another limitation is there are no personal views. All the views that you create will be available to everybody that has access to that workspace. Also, there's no automatic refresh, so it's not very great for a true dashboard, which is what we're going to talk about next. You do have to go in and refresh this data if you want to keep it most up to date. You have limited layout options. So if you notice these columns you have here, that's kind of all you have to go with, which is why they're introducing the workbook option so you can have much more control about the visualization itself. So jumping into dashboards, as I mentioned, all of your visualizations that you create can be pinned to a dashboard, and it supports both metrics and logs. So it's a great way to look at that kind of side by side. Also, you can combine data from multiple sources here. So if you want to pull some data from, like you see here, an application layer and also that security layer, you have that ability. Another thing that I really like about the dashboard versus the view is it's truly a dashboard. So it has automatic refresh, minimum of 5 minutes. So you can refresh your metric data every 5 minutes. Your log data is minute by minute. So you can refresh that up to the minute. And also it's integrated with Azure RBAC or role-based access control. So you can You can enter the users that should have access to this dashboard if you want to put it on a screen in your knock or something like that, and then other users will be denied access to this view. Some limitations of the dashboard, though, and again, I think workbooks is going to alleviate a lot of these concerns, but you have limited control. Again, there's some things you can do and some things that just won't let you in this environment. Workbooks are going to be much more extensible. Log charts that you can create. You'll see a couple in here, some of the graphs and charts. They're limited to the past 30 days. And there's no interactivity with this type data, so you can't do drill throughs, drill ins, all of those type things that views can do. But most of the time, these dashboards are meant for putting them on a screen, putting them on a TV in your office, and keeping that data there just for visualization purposes, not really interactive purposes. So I noticed that dashboards are used more heavily, I would say. If you are looking to do some of the drill down, drill through, all of those things, people usually go for the Power BI option here you'll see on the screen versus the view option, just because you get those rich visualizations and interactivity. It's easily shared throughout your organization with the same options you have within normal Power BI. You can pull in many more data sources, so not only Azure Monitor and Azure Logs, but you can pull in data sources from any other thing that you have deployed in your current environment, Splunk, etc. And obviously better performance with Power BI versus things like Azure Views. There are some limitations with this as well. Again, you can't pipe metrics directly into Power BI, so you will have to store that as a log first, but you have that possibility. This is not managed within Azure itself. It's managed separately, as I'm sure many of you are already aware and have experience in Power BI. So you will need to export that or connect to that somehow separately. It's not built into Azure Monitor itself. And then also within Azure Monitor and Azure or Log Analytics, I guess I should say, you have the ability to have those super lightweight visualizations that I showed before. Those focus on a single or just a couple resources. They're really meant for, I'm noticing something going on. I don't have a view already for it. I just want to take a look over the past 24 hours, over the past week, or the past month, something like that. And it's great for ad hoc visualizations of both metric and log data. I showed you those graphs before. Those are widely used as well because you have the core usually put in Power BI or the core put in the dashboard and eventually that workspace. But for quick visualizations of something you don't always monitor for if there's a network issue or if one of your databases is experiencing some weirdness, doing those impromptu visualizations will also help you a good deal. So jumping into the next area, and I think this is one of the most important areas, I want to leave some questions or time at the end for some questions as well. So we'll jump right into this. Is how do you respond to this data? So you have your data collected, you have it visualized. How do you respond to the data? Visualizations are great, but it's really only half the story. Now that you know there are unwelcome patterns and outliers, what do you do with it, and how do you avoid constantly living in your dashboard or constantly checking a view or constantly opening up your Power BI screen? So one of the biggest parts of Azure Monitor, I think, is the alert logic that's built in with it. And alert logic, it's kind of a misnomer, I would say. An alert isn't only just an alert that you get an email or you get a call or something like that. It can also be automation, as you see on the screen. So you have an alert record that gets stored into your log system, be it Azure Metrics or Log Analytics or both. And then you have rule criteria based on that storage. So you're always storing data into your storage environment. You create a set of rules that are looking for patterns within that environment. If it detects a pattern, then alert logic is triggered. And that alert logic could be in one of two forms, and they could be both as well. An automation of some sort, and we'll talk about the options there, or an alert. And the alert can be in multiple formats as well. And we'll also talk about what options you have there. So alerts are broken up into different action groups, as they're called. It's separate actions for Azure Monitor. They're hyper reusable. They're stored on the Azure environment as well, kind of like a resource. So you can reuse them for different resources. And you can see based on the upper left square there, you have a number of actions options available to you. So for the true alerting, as you can think about it, we have email, we have SMS, we have a push notification to your cell phone if you have the Azure app installed. And we also have a voice call. We can actually call a specific phone number. I think that's very helpful. And you can do a combination of any of those, and you can tier them as well. So maybe if the CPU hits 80%, we'll send you an email. If it hits 85%, we send a text. If it hits 90%, we do a push notification. And if it hits 95, maybe we're starting to call people on a some sort of rotation basis. For more automation, you can do things like automation runbooks, Azure Functions, logic apps, or even webhooks. So you can build your own custom as well. And then you can also pipe all of this data into your own ITSM tool straight from the action group as well. So it's Microsoft wanting to be open and extensible to you. If you want to pipe this data into your third-party SIM tool, great. But I think, like I mentioned before, using some of these automation tools that are built in here will help you for the automation piece specifically. So if your CPU hits 80% and you want to scale up automatically, that is possible. Or if you want to scale out, maybe turn on a separate environment that's usually dormant, you can do that all automated without having to force somebody to go into the portal and start clicking buttons within the portal. I think that's great, not only to save people's weekends for sometimes. So if somebody's not logging in on a Saturday, trying to fix the environment. Not only that, it's important for security and accidental button clicks as well, right? So if you're going in to do something as simple as scaling out or scaling up, a simple misclick could be the difference between creating a D1 or a D4, and those have very different costs associated with them as well. So if you automate all of these things, you don't have to worry about somebody going in on a Saturday trying to rush to get back to whatever they were doing and accidentally clicking the wrong button and scaling something up too much or not enough, or deleting something they shouldn't have, etc. I think automation is really where the power of Azure Monitor comes from. So I mentioned there's two different types of options here. We have alerts and automation, and I talked about most of them, but to recap, alerts, you know the difference between metrics and logs at this point, but you can alert on both of them. Metrics, you can say if something hits a certain threshold, trigger, and that threshold could be over a certain time period as well. So if something hits 90% once, maybe you want to send an alert, but maybe not. I mean, maybe it's just something that got stuck for a second and it's not really a big deal if it hits 90% once. Sometimes it is, and that's possible to alert on that as well. But most of the time, you want to see if it's a trend. So maybe if it hits over 80% for an average of 5 minutes or an average of 10 minutes, that's when you truly want to be alerted. Finding that sweet spot is important. You don't want to have a boy who cried wolf event happen. So every time this thing hits 80%, you get an alert. Your IT staff is going to just start ignoring these messages because they'll say, yeah, it alerts couple times a day, it hits 80% every once in a while, it's not a big deal, and they're going to start ignoring the alerts that truly make sense. So finding that sweet spot similar to the retention is critically important. Log rules are the same. You can say if this event happens once, send me an alert, or if the event happens 5 times over a certain time period, then send the alert. And the alert, as I mentioned before, can be email, SMS, push notification, and voice. And you can do those tiered. So you can say email first, then SMS, then voice and push. You can do them all at once. You could email, text, push, and voice call everybody at the same time and just make sure they get the alert. But you have much flexibility in this. You can email to different groups. You can email to different groups at different percent CPUs, for example. That's just the easiest example, but it could be any metric or any log role that you have. It's quite extensible. But like I mentioned, automation is really where the power is. Most people start with Azure Monitor by sending email alerts or sending text alerts just to kind of see where their threshold should be. But what you'll notice when you start doing this, if you start going down this path, you'll notice that if you get an alert that says, hey, the web app that I have is at 95% CPU, you'll go in, you'll add another core, you'll add another instance, or you'll expand it. You'll do something, and that something is going to be highly repeatable. So you'll see in the screenshot here, its processor time is greater than 90%. What you can do with Azure Automation is, as I mentioned before, save your staff from having to log in after hours or on weekends, or even during the day. Just let them focus on their actual day-to-day job and not focus on making sure this thing is humming along correctly. There's ways in Azure to automate and take that workload off of your staff. So automation is, I think, where your best return is going to come from with Azure Monitor. You can do things like if the CPU goes above 80%, you have uh, a minimum virtual machine count of 2, and you have a maximum virtual machine count of 5. Current capacity right now, as you can see in this example, is 3. So what you're saying to Azure Automation is, I'm okay with paying a minimum of 2, no less than 2, because I want to have redundancy. And I'm okay with paying a maximum of 5 instances. And that's part of your budget and cost management that we talked about in one of the questions that we had. But you could say, okay, if this runs all the time at 5, then we're going to be at or near budget. If it runs at 2, we're going to be under budget. We're going to expect we're going to pay about 3. But that way you can give that power to Azure Automation and say, look, if the CPU is greater than 80%, give me another instance. Something that I see people miss the mark on here all the time, though, is go back down is critically important, right? So they have the process, or they have the automation set up that if the processor time is greater than 80%, scale up. The piece that they miss is scale down. So when something gets busy, you have a busy day, whatever it might be, these processors go up, and then they just kind of stay there. And then that's when you'll see things hovering at like 10% or 5% CPU for forever. So it's also important, just as important, really, to scale down as much as scaling up. So what this visual doesn't show is that scale down. If the processor time is less than 20% or less than 10%, whatever you as a business decide is that threshold, if it's less than 10% for, I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 6 hours, whatever that threshold you want to set up, if that does occur, then scale down your environment. Go down to that minimum capacity of 2, because you shouldn't be paying for 5 if you're really using 2. Right sizing your environment is huge, and that's where you're going to find the most return. You won't have to have your staff being paid on the weekend to go in and modify the environment. You also won't have your 5 virtual machines running when you really only need 2. You can automate all of this, do it once, test it a couple times. You won't have to think about it. So moving into integrate and export, and please ask any questions on the response section as well, because I think that's huge, or anything we've already covered. But now we're going to talk about integrate and export, which is another really important thing that I think people miss the mark on fairly frequently. They think of Azure Monitor as, if I have it, then this is the one I'm going with for the future, or I already have Splunk, so I don't need to use Azure Monitor, and I'm just going to zone out. That's really not the case. Azure Monitor is powerful as a standalone application, and it's also very powerful as a supplement to a SIM tool that you already have. You already have investment in. Really, you can use it in conjunction. So integrations and export really is in 3 main areas. You have event hubs, logic apps, and custom APIs. So event hubs, I'm not sure if we talked about this in Azure Data Week in the past, but basically it's an Azure resource itself. It's a streaming platform, really. So you can take all of the data within Azure Monitor, pipe it to an event hub. When the event hub picks up on some of these events, it can then pipe it to a certain flow that you define. And it could be a partner SIM tool, a separate monitoring tool altogether, be it in the cloud, be it on-prem, whatever it needs to be. That can go the other way too, though. So if your SIM tool is picking up on things, you can pipe that data to an event hub and then pipe that into Azure Monitor itself. So that's a two-way street there, and it's important to decide where you want your single pane of glass to be. Just because you have the single pane of glass to review your environment doesn't mean you have to have one environment handling your automation. So maybe you want your Splunk tool to handle on-prem, maybe you want Azure Monitor to handle cloud, but one or the other should be your single pane of glass getting all of the data, so your users can go to one place and see all of the information across the board. And it's important to note that Azure Monitor is open and extensible to virtual machines and items that are not Azure resources as well. So on-prem and also AWS or Google Cloud, you can pipe all that into Azure Monitor and have that one pane of glass. Just because we had that question, I want to point out too that you have that possibility for cost management as well. There might be some cost management price differences. So, if you're doing it in AWS, it might have a different cost than if you're doing it in Azure, but that is possible. Logic apps and APIs are just ways to kind of do that same thing. So either piping data in or piping data out. You can use logic apps or event hubs if it's more out of the box built into the Azure environment. If it's not, and you have like a custom on-prem environment, you can access the API itself. So throughout the presentation today, and I know we're running sort of short on time, so I want to wrap it up and kind of talk about a couple more areas that we haven't covered today in the monitoring scope overall. So you can see in this screenshot, this is kind of the scope of monitoring in Azure altogether, minus cost. This is the performance and health monitoring landscape. And we talked about these highlighted areas today, but I want to touch on a couple of the other areas. You can see there's really four. I kind of grouped a couple of those together in the infrastructure monitoring. I want to touch on each one of these at a high level, and then I'll go into any Q&A that you guys might have as a result of the conversations here today. Number one, and I touched on this already, so I'll make it short and sweet, is application insights. I think application insights is a huge value add as a standalone application, but especially if you're integrating it with Azure Monitor. Excuse me. Application insights basically allows you to take your custom written application that's hosted in Azure and pipe that data from the application layer into Azure Monitor itself. If you do that, you're really getting a full view of the landscape altogether. So you see if Azure is having a system-wide outage. You'll see if a resource is having an outage. You'll see if your subscription is having an outage. You can see if your network's having an outage, but then also you can see if your application is having an outage. And you can take all of that data, have again, I've said it a million times, you're probably tired of hearing me say it, but a single pane of glass is critical, right? So you can have one screen that says, here's all of the metrics about the network and the application and Azure itself. And you can look at it at one layer, one view, and say, oh, well, when my CPU spikes over 90%, this application piece fails because it's timing out, and my network is also experiencing a slowdown at the same time. So if all of those three things happened, maybe there's one issue that's relating to all three of those problems. Application insights, obviously, because it is custom, does involve a little bit more custom development to get that piped in, taking the data from your application and piping it into Azure. But it's not something that's super crazy to do, and I think the value add is extensive on that. Next, coming from my bread and butter being infrastructure and security. Obviously, Azure has abilities to do monitoring in both of those as well, and I highlighted two of many here today. Network Watcher, I think, is very, very critical to keep a view of what's going on in the environment at the network layer. So you could do things like packet captures, next hop, IP flow verify, NSG flow logs, which is huge. I've used that just recently to see what issues were going on in the environment. Network Watcher is great for your network people. So trying to trace down a problem at the network layer, I think that Network Watcher will really help out your network team, but also using that in conjunction with everything else we talked about today can really help you isolate an area of concern in your environment. Similarly, we have so the Security Center. It helps with threat detection monitoring on your network, like Network Watcher, but also your Azure resources and partner solutions as well, things like SQL and other third parties that are built into Azure itself. In the marketplace, you have ability to kind of dive deep into those partner solutions and see if there's any threats going on in that environment as well. And again, all of that data is available in Azure Monitor, as well as the Security Center. Again, leading back to that single pane of glass. So you can see your network, you see your security, see your performance, your health, etc., and kind of have it all under one hat. Next is Azure Advisor, which if you haven't used yet, you definitely should. Azure Advisor is a quote. You don't see my air quotes, but I'm air quoting, personalized cloud consultant, according to Microsoft. So basically, it helps you with four distinct areas you see on the screen: HA, security, performance, and cost. It will actually give you recommendations with step-by-step solutions on how to correct that recommendation or correct that potential issue. A highlight or a caveat that I'll say here that I mention every time I talk about Azure Advisor is Azure Advisor does not necessarily eliminate people like me, Azure architects. They try to give you kind of a way to optimize your environment, but they're not looking at the single pane of glass. Really, is what it comes down to. Azure Advisor says, for instance, in cost, you'll see if you go into your environment right now, I would bet 2 to 1 that you're going to see something along the lines of you can do a dedicated payment plan. I forget what they call it in that environment, but you can basically pay for your virtual machine for a year or 3 years or 5 years upfront, rather than paying hour by hour. And they give you a substantial discount to do that. I think it's like 40% or something crazy. However, if you have that running 24/7 and you're always going to have that running 24/7 as part of your architecture, that's great, right? Because you're going to have it running all year into next year, into the year 3. So paying for that upfront, it's going to be a substantial upfront cost, sure, but then you're going to save a bunch over the year, over 3 years. But if you have the ability to turn that off on weekends, or turn it off after 8 p.m. and turn it back on at 6 a.m., something like that, you're really going to be optimizing your cost better by doing that, rather than doing the dedicated instance. So keep in mind that Azure Advisor recommendations are just that. They're recommendations. They're not, this is absolutely what you should do. So use this to kind of get your wheels spinning, but then also think critically on, is this the best thing for me and my organization and my environment? Next, we have service health, and I think this is the last slide I have here, and then we'll jump into a couple questions with the couple minutes we have left. So service health, and I mentioned it kind of all along in this presentation, so it shouldn't be new, but it is something that I wanted to point out and show a screenshot of. Service health is a way to get Azure alerts, Azure Monitor, or Azure Log alerts, whatever you want to think of them as, at the Azure level, at the Azure level itself. So if there's issues with a data center at Azure, or maybe there's some planned maintenance going on, or some health advisories, as you can see on the left-hand side there, this is where you get the visibility into that. If you go to Service Health in your environment right now, you can filter on different subscriptions and filter on different regions, and even filter on specific services or all of the services in a selected region. And you can see if there's any issue. Somebody, messed up a server replacement and some corner of your server rack is down. That will be listed in service issues. Planned maintenance, maybe they're swapping a power cable or something in the environment. Some guy somewhere is trying to replace it, and they'll probably give you that planned maintenance notification, even though they likely have a way around that. They'll likely move your data for you within the same region, to avoid having you have any downtime. They want to keep you aware of what's going on, just so you have uh, prepared a disaster recovery option if needed. What I think is great about service health is it really optimizes your DR strategy. So if you have service health being piped into your logs as well, that's another added benefit. So you can say, hey, my CPU spiked, my network was crazy, my application went down, and it all correlated to a service issue on East US 2 where they were having trouble doing XYZ. You can see if maybe that was the cause of your issue. What I will note is, being Azure and being Microsoft, this happens very few and far between. Planned maintenance is pretty frequent. Obviously, they just give you that notification, but it very rarely has any effect on you as the end user, as the customer. They handle it in the back end and make sure that you are up and running. But it is important that anything can happen. And, natural events, maybe something comes up and floods a data center in an environment somewhere, and it's causing some issues there. Keep an eye on it. You can go in and create alerts on this as well. You can get notified by email or text or et cetera, anything we talked about today, if there is a service issue or if is some sort of planned maintenance. And it's important to review these pretty frequently to make sure that you won't have any issues going forward. And that was my last slide. So I did see 2 more questions come in. One of them is, can I show a quick demo of how to set up an automated scale down? I don't have an environment pulled up, unfortunately, but basically the scale down and scale up is all within Azure Monitor. You can go into Azure Monitor and see where your options are, and then scaling up and scaling down, the actual act of doing that can be done in Azure Automation. It can be done in sort of logic app or function, there's many ways to do it. There's many ways to skin that cat, if you will. Definitely give us a contact us if you want some further discussion on that. And there actually may be another webinar on that as well, on how specifically to do that. But it is important that you mention scale down. because that is something I wanted to highlight in this conversation today. Scaling up is just as important as scaling down. So make sure that you attack it both ways. Just as it is important to auto turn on something and auto turn off something, it's important to scale up and scale back down when you don't need anything. When your spike is over, you can right size the environment, as they would call it. Can Azure Advisor notify if we underutilize any of the resources to downsize? Yes. Again, very good question. So Azure Advisor will also say, hey, we noticed that this specific resource, let's say VM, just for fun, this specific VM is not being utilized. Consider downsizing. Just as it will say, hey, we noticed this VM is, acting crazy. It's spiking all the time. Consider scaling up or scaling out. Scaling up meaning a bigger tier, scaling out meaning multiple copies of that same tier. That's a great question. The answer is yes. In the cost management section, it'll basically say, hey, you need to take a look at this and think critically if you need that. If it is a performance issue, it'll obviously be in that performance section, but it'll tell you, hey, from a cost perspective, you need to right size. Right size is a Microsoft term, and they really really want you to do that. It's kind of counterintuitive for a business to tell you to spend less money, but they really want you to right size your environment because they want you to see that the cloud and Azure can really pay dividends, and you can have much more advanced workloads for the same cost. So definitely right sizing is important. I love those last two questions. I apologize for not having that environment set up for an automation. But there is some webinars already created for that, and contact us if you need any help with that. But I think those two last questions are great to keep in mind, that Azure Monitor is not just for performance, it's also for cost. And that's kind of an important thing to drive home. So thanks so much. If there's any other questions, let me know. If not, I'll turn it back over.
All right, Josh, thank you so much. It looks like there isn't any more questions. I think that you have answered them all. Looks like there's only 7 in the Ask Question panel, and looks like you got all the ones in the chat too as well. So that's perfect. Josh, like I said before, thank you again for hosting. You guys, thank you so much for attending. If you guys would like to get to the next session, please just go up in your left-hand corner and click the more menu, and it should have a drop down menu. You should be able to select the next session from there. For those of you asking about the recordings are available like about 5 minutes after the session's in. You can just come back to the session and play it back as many times as you want to. But if you guys have any questions up until then or now or later, please feel free to reach out to Josh or myself. We hope you guys are enjoying the conference so much. Like I said before, please give us back your feedback. We would love to know. Put it in the chat. You guys can follow us on Twitter and let us know there. Just however, send us an email. We would love to hear from you guys on how we can continue to make this conference bigger and better. But thank you guys so much for attending. Josh, again, thank you so much for hosting, and we hope to see you guys in the next session.
Absolutely. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.